let's start with kind of what filters are about in the first place. A filter is sort of aptly named tool. It's a piece of code that looks for other things inside the HTML that's going on, filters that thing based on some kind of parameters, tags, other things like that, and then changes what gets displayed in response to that. So that's what a filter fundamentally does inside of the platform. Filters are sort of a mix of highly functional elements, right? They help certain technologies and integrations actually work, but they also can provide some increased interactivity and increased user experience that students in particular will find helpful for them. So that's one of the reasons to think about them. And we'll kind of break down the filters along those lines as we take a look at some of them. Filters are plugins. Most of them are available on the site by default. There's a handful that are not, mostly because they come with an integration that they work with. The filter doesn't do anything without the rest of the integration, so it's just not there. Things like Ally, for example, the accessibility tool, has a filter that you use to make Ally do its thing. But it's useless without the rest of Ally behind it. So it's not there unless you have Ally. Kind of a decent example. And if you think of what a filter is like and how it does its thing, emojis might be a nice contextual image of what that is, right? I can make an emoji in a chat window, for example, and when I type in a colon and a close parenthesis, the filter in this chat window turns that into the picture of a smiley face, right? That's a filter in action. That's what filters do. So we're not the only ones that have but let's take a look at some of the basics of what filters do and how we use them in the site administratively. Filters are found inside of your plugins list. And if we head on down to plugins, alphabetically hiding down there in the Fs, there are filters. You've probably seen them. You maybe even have poked at them and checked them out over time. Hopefully you have. But there's some sets of filters that have some settings. There are some common filter settings. We'll kind of skip that for a moment. And then there's this manage filters where all the business really takes place. The manage filters page is just a huge list of filters that you've got available on the site and whether or not they're active. I have an awful lot of them on my site, kind of probably too many, but I demonstrate a lot of stuff, so I turn on a lot of weird things. You quite reasonably might have fewer turned on your site. First up, I wanted to talk about these options in here. There's on, there's disabled, and then there's off but available. It's sort of a third option in there. And you can see here I have several that are in that off but available setting in use here. Those are filters that I'm going to make available to be used in context somewhere in the site, but I'm not turning them on for everything on the whole site all the time. It's a bit of a nod to the idea that the filters probably just shouldn't be on all the time, always. These ones in specific are filters that have very use-specific applications. I'm using that filter on purpose in a particular place, and so it's not necessarily good to turn them on all the time. Off but available is handy, and it means that then when I look at content or even a course and its filter settings, I can choose to turn that filter on in that specific context while not having it on everywhere else. Another setting in here we're thinking about is this application setting. Content or content and headings are the options. Content and headings means to look at the content plus the title space, the name space for objects. Turning on content and headings kind of seems like maybe, why bother having two different settings there? Really, the answer is adding the heading space actually adds a significant amount of overhead to the processing time for filters. It's more work than just the tiny amount of space that the heading takes up as a visual element. And so, in fact, it has a pretty heavy impact on the performance of the filter overall on the site. It's best to always just assume content is the right level of application, and that content and headings applies because there's a specific reason to put it that way. Otherwise, leave it at just content. And segueing from that idea of performance, why not just have them all on all the time? Why do they, generally speaking, they all ship in disabled modes? Well, that's because there are a few reasons, but one of the chief reasons is that each one adds overhead to the amount of time it takes for the site to work. Each page render has to go through all the filters that are on. So if you turn on every single filter, you'll just watch the site's performance progressively get slower and slower and slower as each filter has to be engaged in order, and you can see the order in which they run here based on this sequencing. Each filter runs one after the other, reading all of the content that's being presented on the page. So if you turn all of them on, it really dramatically slows down the site. So you don't want to do that. but using a few filters, yeah, you probably won't notice anything. So pick and choose the filters that make sense. Likewise, if they were always all on all the content, you probably have some unintended consequences. Things that people didn't expect to happen are going to start happening. They're going to ask support questions like, hey, how come this is doing that? Or where'd that come from? Or why is all my stuff linked in my quiz now? There's actually a contextual use for filters, and I'd really recommend that, even though I've got a lot of filters that are on all the time here, having it on as off but available is actually a really wise way to use them, because then the filter is very intentional when you turn it on. You put it on in an entire course, you put it on in the content inside of the course because you want to use the filter, not because the filter happens to be on. There are certainly filters that make sense to be always on and always working, things like this Ally filter or Kaltura filters or H5P, that are kind of always a possibility on the site, right? That could be used anywhere. Wherever they show up, you're going to want them to be used with the filter. Go ahead and turn them on. But otherwise, leave them in the off state or leave them in the on or the off but available state, and that way things will work out best. So yeah, there are some settings for some of the filters. Some of the filters don't really have settings. They just kind of do the thing they do. Some of them have settings. Sometimes those settings are just things like names, and sometimes those settings are about how they apply to something. So if we pick on a filter to start with, let's talk about media and content type filters. These media plugin filters, there's actually a settings page here, but now it forwards to the new place for these plugin behaviors to be managed, which is the media players management space. There are a bunch of different media players available on the site to be used. You can manage the order in which they're used and which ones are available and which ones are disabled. Some of that can be preferencing, some of that can be institutional policies, and some of that can be sort of best practices, right? I have Flash videos, SWIFT files are disabled on my site, mostly because that's content that's not supported by browsers anymore anyway. So So there's not really any point in going ahead and bothering to put a player wrapped around that Swift file that's not going to render in the browser anyway. So I go ahead and turn it off. No harm there. There's plenty of applications and reasons to kind of fiddle with these, but they also work out of the box. As a general recommendation, what I'll say is kind of two things. One, if you've had your site for quite a few years, even if it was on Moodle somewhere else and then moved to us at some point recently, it's possible that you've sort of collected some legacy settings around these players and the renderers for multimedia content. It's worth checking them out to make sure that they're using kind of the current best practices rather than inheriting what was available 5 or 6 years ago as the default. Everybody who gets a brand new site from us gets the kind of best practices for the settings now, and everybody that kind of has a site from the past, it's worth checking them out. Make sure that things are working right. Enabling more than one of the players, and you can see here I have an awful lot of different players enabled, is helpful, in fact, because some players don't play well with some device and browser combinations. And so having more options means that when my device says, well, I don't use the JS player, it can fall back to a more native HTML5 player that's not as neat as the JS player, but still gets the job done, for example. And that's a sort of classic problem in multimedia content. Yeah. Joe, you had a question.
I did. On the video players, I'm assuming that it starts at the top and it works down the list to check to see if that is the player that it needs. Is that a safe assumption?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And yeah, and that's really, you want to think about it in that order with both the players here and with the filters in general, is that it's going to start prioritizing at the top of the list and then fail downwards down the list until it gets to something that does work for it. And when they, particularly when they support more than one type of content, or when the more than one player supports the same kind of content, like the MP4s, right? The JS player will support MP4s, and also the HTML5 player will support MP4s. So it will default to the JS player first, and then if the device can't handle the JS player for whatever reason, then it will fail downward to the native HTML5 player, and so on. Yeah. And Kim, part of why I wanted to do this thing today was to start poking at some of these best practices for the settings. There are some documentation about it on help sites like Moodle Docs, and our documentation site is getting some updates for that as well. But part of why I wanted to have this session today was to kind of give some of these best practices out. So we'll try to collect all of this information and make it available at the end of the session as well, so that you can kind of reference back to it. But yeah, good question as well. Cool. I'm gonna jump out of this and back to my filters page. But there's the media players settings space where you can manage the settings for various players. And if I head back to filters and manage filters, I can see that list again. Overall, the multimedia player plugins, everybody's got them on by default always. It's something the site always uses. And there are also integration plugins, like we mentioned, Ally, H5P. They all have some settings that they're going to use potentially or not, and that's all dependent on that tool and the integration. If you're not using those tools, if that's something that you're not making available on the site, there's no reason to have the filter turned on. You can feel safe to turn it off. It's pretty simple that way. Another filter I wanted to talk about was the MathJax. Similarly, there's some legacy behavior around the display of mathematics in the system. Older approaches using things like algebra notation and the LaTeX filter and things like that used a process where code in the background would generate a picture of a mathematical expression based on the syntax for the mathematical expression in the HTML, and then replace the syntax with a picture of what the mathematical expression looks like. I mean, it was the solution that worked at the time, but it's not very accessible. It's not a very user-friendly experience. It doesn't scale dynamically, right? And you're sort of just injecting pictures into text. It was not a great solution, and it didn't look very good. So over time, it's moved to font-based solutions. Now there are font libraries that support mathematical expressions. MathJax is the most popular one. It's the one in use. It's the favored one. And this filter is the one that you should be using to render mathematical expressions. They look really good as a mathematician. I can say that with high confidence. It's the best thing out there, really, in a lot of ways. If you've got Wirus, you've got a slightly better version of MathJax through the Wirus plugins. Wirus is a paid-for solution for mathematical expressions and other kind of science-specific engines. So they develop and make their own versions of things that are even better. But MathJax is free. It's available for everybody to use. It's really good. Uses some JavaScript libraries that load into the page along with the font libraries. If you have an older site, or a site that has been around for a while, it's possible that you've inherited old settings and haven't switched to MathJax. I'm pretty sure that at this point, everybody has been switched to MathJax, whether or not they knew it. It's part of an accessibility fix. Again, those pictures, not terribly accessible. The font is accessible, right? It reads out as font. It's a much better way to go. It's worth just double checking to make sure it's the one that you've got, it's turned on. There are some settings for it. Just to take a quick look at those settings. I'll be honest, there's no reason to fuss with these settings at all, unless you have a specific reason to get in there and change them, particularly to address a known issue that you're having. If you don't have any issues, you don't really want to mess with these things. But if you've got your own delivery server for MathJax because you're using your own version of the libraries, you would change where you're picking it up there. If you've got some configuration styles that you want to apply system-wide because you're a pro at MathJax, then you would make those changes here. I'm not doing it, and I'm a mathematician and pretty nerdy, so there's probably no reason for you to do it unless you have a specific thing that you're trying to address. So that's kind of where it all comes in. You can create custom delimiters for equations, and in my case, I said to use to also work on the old style LaTeX and TeX notation filters, because I wrote all my stuff like 8 or 9 years ago in the old filters, and I don't want to go through and change my old stuff, so I just said, use the old stuff and the new stuff, please, to figure out where a mathematical expression is. It's pretty straightforward otherwise. Excuse me. Any questions about that? It's pretty simple, I think. But again, if you've got an older site, it's worth just making sure that you're not, say, stuck with or sitting around with algebra notation filters on as well. Go ahead and turn those off, for example. But for anybody who has a new site, the algebra notation and the text notation filters should be off and probably not even available for you unless your my site is like about 12 years old. So, you know, it's got a lot of garbage on it. The simple way to put it. Let's talk about one of my favorite filters, the multi-language filter. Multilang is a filter that allows you to identify text when you're writing it in HTML format with a language that that text applies to using span tags. It's a font styling. And when you do that, you can create sections of text for different languages. And when users present themselves with one language or another language, they can see different text come out of the page based on their language settings. It's a great way to support audiences that use multiple languages as their language of preference, and to really give them a seamless experience in a single space. I don't think of it as something necessarily that applies in, let's say, a higher education space. But it could come up. Usually the folks that ask me about using this and are interested in using it are teaching in multiple countries, or teaching audiences from multiple countries and want to present content in multiple languages dynamically for them. There is an older syntax for that that's available as well. If you have old multi-lang content, I do on my site, it's a pretty old site, you can tell this tool to also support the old syntax. I went through and fixed my old content because I like the new syntax better. The new syntax is actually more style appropriate for CSS. So I went ahead and conformed. Just to give you an idea of what we're sort of talking about with that, right? I don't know if you've ever played with this, but let's say I'll switch to Catalan as my language down here. So not only does the text for the, Drift is very confused by my use of Catalan, I think. There we go. So inside the platform, all of the sort of administrative elements and the navigational elements have language packs that change their language. And so that's nice, but the content itself doesn't necessarily change, right? So this text changed, and then you'll see down here, this text changed because I have a translation of that content in that language available. So it went ahead and updated that for me for this user in that language because that user can see this. This content normally wouldn't change without a multi-language variant of that content available to the user. And so that's kind of what we're talking about there. Now, you could also maybe see, I'm not sure if it's sharing it. No, it isn't. My browser will automatically offer to translate the content on the page into my native language for me because they all do that now. So it's relatively straightforward. Off but available is a great option for multi-language. I think it's the one I would always recommend unless you knew system-wide we had a reason to use it all the time. Because you're exactly right. It's the kind of thing that really shouldn't be turned on all the time. It's not very friendly most of the time. It's not very necessary most of the time. And you're applying that filter to all the content on the off chance that somebody's using it. Fundamentally, and there's some good docs right up on this one. What you do is in the HTML editor, you go to the HTML view and you add span tags that identify the language class type and the class multilang for this section of text. And so you write the text in English and you put in the tag language en multilang for this stretch. You close the span and you open the span tag and you put in, say, yes for Espanol, and a multilang, and then put in the Spanish translation of the text, and so on. It's a pretty, once you start using it, it's really easy and kind of fun. Let's talk about a couple of my other favorites in here. Activity names, auto-linking, and glossary auto-linking are two that I really appreciate and enjoy. They're both in the off but available setting, so that they can be turned on in a specific context. Neither one of them have any settings because they basically just do the thing that they do. So there's not more to be said about it than that. Activity linking is activity linking. When a section of text that is using the filter has words in the text that are the name of an activity, the filter takes that and turns it into a link to that activity. It's kind of cool. It's a great way to create interlinked dynamic content inside the course, which you could do by pasting URLs in the background as links, but when you copy and paste URLs, you have to update those every time the class changes, like say if you restore a new version of the course. So that's kind of a drag. But if you use the filter, like I've turned on the filter in this section where I'm identifying activities that are required in my course here for my students, I just turned the filter on in that section, and so the parts in here that are matching the names of activities automatically create links to that activity inside the text. And then when the student reads the text, they can just click on the link and follow it to where they're going. When I copy and restore the course, because it's a filter doing the links and not me making the links automatically update to the right place, right? Because you can see here, I didn't make a link in that. The filter's doing all the work. So if I edit this label, I can come in here and inside the object administration, whether it's a course or an activity or a resource inside the course, there's a filters option in there. And I can head into those filters and I can see that I've turned on the activity names auto-linking filter so that it automatically does that. Now you'll also see I've default on the glossary auto-linking filter is set to default on in here. If you recall from this last screen we were looking at, it's actually set to off but available on the site level. So why is it saying default on inside this course? That's because I added it in the course as a filter that's on always for all my content inside this course. So if I head to my filters list in the course administration menu, right, I switched over to course administration and hit that filters list. I took that filter that was defaulted to off and I said, well, actually, for this whole course, all the content in this course, I want that filter to be on. I want to use it in this space. So that would be, for example, if I had a specific course that was going to have and make use of multiple language content, that would be a great approach, right? I would come into the course, and rather than turn it on for every single thing inside the course, I could just say, I want it on for all the content in this course. Turn it on one place and let it go. It's kind of handy. So those activity filters, again, it's just a way to create dynamic content, dynamic lists of content for my students. Things link up nicely. It's kind of slick and neat and very contextual, right? I don't want to turn that on everywhere in the class. I just want to turn it on in sections of the course where I know I'm using or I want to offer that capability, right? So it makes a lot of sense in that context. This glossary auto-linking behavior, glossary filter is one of my favorites. I think it's really something exceptional about the platform that is not common in other solutions out there. And so let's just show it off for a sec. I've written a glossary for my course. You could also have a system level glossary that's applying everywhere, however you want to run those types of things. It's full of key concepts and terms. And so in this text, I have that glossary filter on because it's on for everything in the course. And so when the student sees a term or a phrase that's inside the glossary, it automatically links to the definition I've provided for that concept or that term inside the glossary. So they don't have to leave this page to get those definitions. As they're reading content, they can just explore the meanings of this terminology right inside the content. Yeah, it's one of my absolute favorites, Summer. It's so cool. It's so tied beautifully to teaching and learning that it's just, I think it's fantastic. I've also set it up so it's recursive. So within the definition, key terms also link to their definitions. So I can sort of just explode into this strange little trail of learning stuff and really get down into the weeds of understanding these concepts. Again, right in the middle of my learning. And from a teaching and learning perspective, right, I'm keeping the student engaged in the content while they're exploring and reinforcing their knowledge. But I'm also more tightly controlling concepts and definitions, right? Rather than hoping that they Google land on the right definition for this term and not like something from Urban Dictionary that is complete nonsense. I'm controlling the definitions, and when they need to know what that word means, I'm giving them that meaning rather than letting the world sort of give them a random possibility of getting the right meaning. It's nice. It's very controlling. It sort of satisfies those A-type needs that some folks have, but it also, from a teaching and learning perspective, really tightly integrates that learning experience back together, right? I'm not opening separate tabs. I'm not looking up stuff in another space away from the content that I'm trying to learn. I'm just doing it all in one place. And we can dive into the glossary for a really long time, probably just do a whole workshop on the glossary. But there's a lot of cool other alternatives out there. You can set up glossaries so that students provide questions, right? So they can put concepts and terms into the glossary and say, I don't know what this means. And then other students can come in and create proposed definitions for those concepts that can be evaluated and gated through an approval to become the approved definition of that term. There's a lot of cool interactive learning options with Glossary as well. But for today, Glossary is really cool because we can turn on this filter inside of text and have that filter provide us with meaningful contextual reinforcement of key concepts. It's really groovy. Now, can anyone think of a possible issue with turning on that glossary throughout my entire course? I'll give you a minute to think about that. Quizzes, exactly, Jeff. I knew somebody was sitting there sipping on a cup of coffee thinking about that. So right, quizzes, particularly if the quiz is designed to assess your understanding of key concepts and terms. If I turn on, inside of the quiz automatic linking, then I've sort of given away the answer. Joe, I was being generous. I know. So one thing to think about here is that in the context of the quiz itself, I can come in and say, glossary auto linking, please turn back off for my quiz, where I'm testing your knowledge and I want to give you those answers through the glossary auto linking behavior. Typically, I have a lot more content in there that I want the glossary linking on than I want to turn it off for. So it's easier to just turn it on for everything and then go back and turn it off for the quizzes specifically. So there you go. And you can go back to your stipend because that was a great question or a great answer, and it was perfect. All right. Well, I think I've kind of wrapped up the pieces I wanted to do, and I think we're coming in right about the end of the time here. We've had some good questions, but I want to check in and see if anybody has any other questions or if you wanted to know about a filter that I haven't talked about that seems exciting and interesting to you. And otherwise, y'all can have a great day. Or I guess I could talk about word censorship, because I'm just going to that one, because it's complicated, but it's not really that complicated. Anybody want to see word censorship? We'll talk about what that one does. It sounds very like ominous and looming.
I have a funny story about word censorship filter.
Oh, let's hear it.
The biology teacher was having her anatomy quiz, and she didn't know the filter was on in her class. And so the words were, and she had a diagram, and the students are supposed to label.
That black bar goes over there.
And it wouldn't let them type in the words for ones, and it was some of her answers that she had put in. It was really funny. She was getting emails and Moodle messages from her students, and all kinds of things were going in, and she was over here, help, what's going on? Got a message, you know, that she was being censored.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so that was fun.
That's hilarious. Hilarious. If you didn't know, I think that gave you a good vision of what it does. Word censorship is a way to create a censored list of terms, phrases, words that the system will filter out of content. And so when students type in bad words, it takes the bad word and strips it out. On my site, I've made my own custom list, which is the word monkey. And so it is blotting out that word when I wrote it, because that's what it does. Now, I will say 2 caveats. Snap, I noticed when I tested it out, doesn't work correctly with word censorship. The style tag doesn't, it highlights the word, but it highlights the word in a color that doesn't do anything. So it highlights the word in white with an alpha of 0. So in fact, it doesn't highlight it at all. so there's that. But then also I will note that if you're clever, you can circumvent the blocking of the word because if you hit select, there's more fix that I could do for that. I just have to change the select behavior as well. But I was too lazy to make that fix. But if you were really fired up about using word censorship on your site to kind of manage language and behavior on the site, it's certainly possible to do. Each language comes with its own list of censored words in a language pack file called censor.cs. .php in the languages. If you aren't familiar with the process, there's a space in languages where you can customize a language. And if you choose a language to customize, you can open up the language pack and then open up that file and add extra words to the file, essentially. I'm not going to open it up because it's filled with words that probably a bit offensive. So I won't share that with you, but I'll show you that this is the way that you would go to find that list to read all the words and giggle or whatever it was you wanted to do. But yeah, so this is a way to manage strings inside the system. The word censorship filter itself also comes with a custom list, and that's how I managed mine. So I overrode the language pack filter with my own filter list of words. And that list of words is the word monkey. So there you go. That's how that works. Well, alrighty, folks. Thank you for everything. Oh, great. And yeah, there's an FAQ about that multimedia plugins and how to manage which players are in there. I think without reading it, I'm going to say that they probably said more or less exactly the same thing I said, which is it's best to turn them all on so that things fail over and order them in the order of precedence that you want them to work. So, and if I'm wrong and they have better answers in there, post them into the community. There you go. A little plug for the community site. Well, cool. Thank you very much, everybody. Any other questions or any amusing anecdotes before I let you go? Otherwise, I will say thank you. Oh, you're welcome, sir. My pleasure. Thank you all, and enjoy your day.